In this video we'll look at loops. Loops are constructions to make sure that a certain piece of code is repeated a number of times. So with the if, we saw how one condition can determine which part of the code will be executed, but that's a one-time thing. With loops, you can run a bit of code over and over again, basically until a sort of condition is met. There are two types of loops, the for loops and the while loops. The for loops are the simpler ones, so we'll first have a look at the for loop in this video, and then in the next video we'll have a look at the while loop. So a very simple for loop will look like this. For I in range 5, you see that we have for is the statement, then we have I is the iterator, the variable that will run in a range of 5. And with Python, the start is always 0, and in the end is not included. And in this case, we only specify the end, which means that we will have I run from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then stop before it reaches 5. So if we now print a bit of code, print hello world here. Print hello again. We see also that as we end this for statement also with a colon, that Python knows that this this block of code needs to be indented afterwards, and as soon as we're done with backspace, we're back at the beginning, and this will only be executed once. As it is not indented, this doesn't have this same margin, and therefore this is not part of the loop block of code in here. So if we run this, then we will see hello world, hello again. We repeat it 5 times. If we want to know what happens to this variable I, we can print I. We can say I is I. I will run it again, and we see that indeed hello world, I is 0, then the code is repeated, and I gets all the values specified by this function. It's a bit comparable with the list, even though in Python 3 it is no longer a list. But if you want to know how it would look as a list, you can say range, let's make a list of range 5. And you see that basically all the values that it will return are 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Range 5, the range function can also be used with start, stop, and optionally a step. So if we specify 1 times 10 times 2, what will this do? Well, this will start with 1, and then use the step 2, and stop at 10. With step 2 it will never arrive at 10, of course. So what are the values that you will see? Well, 9 is still less than 10, but 11 is over 10, and therefore it stops at 9, because that's the last valid number. So 1, 3, 5, the odd numbers below 10 is what is a result of this. Of course, normally you would then do this differently. For instance, do it like this and make sure that it ends, that the end limit is probably also a multiple of the step compared to the start. And of course you can also run backwards. If you start with 10, end at 0 and then minus 2, and if we want to see the values of those, we can change that into a list and see it run backwards. This function list is actually a new variable type, which we see here, which is a set of variables, a collection of variables in a certain order, and they can be anything. In this case they are integers, but we could also make lists which hold a bit of text, a float, a boolean, and they can all be in the same list. And the idea of a list is that we can then access a certain element, list 2 for instance, and this will then give the third element of the list, as counting starts with 0 again. 0 is text, 1 is 3.5, and list 2 is actually the number 2, the integer that we put in there. list 0 is the first element, and list -1 is the last element, as this is sort of shorthand for the list of the length of the list -1, which will also be the last element, as the length of the list is here 1, 2, 3, 4. So 4 minus 1 is 3. When we start counting with 0, 0, 1, 2, 3, that gives us the last element, and that's why list -1 is actually the last element of the list, and list -2 is the one but last element. So you specify those by, as you saw with the square brackets. So round brackets indicate the function, and the square brackets indicate a list which can contain a list of numbers. You can even have lists which contain a list. If we specify it like this, the first element can be a list on its own, and the second can be something completely different. And here we see that a list element 0 is actually a list, and if we want the first element of that list, then we can again specify after this list what the index should be. For those indices you also use the square bracket. So square brackets are used to define a list, but also for the index in that list. And the for loop here uses a range function, but you can also use lists there. For instance, if we would specify here a list, then I will run through each of these values and then print those values and repeat the block of code for each of these values. So there's an example you could say, for instance, if we have cars, a list of cars, Peugeot, no, Mercedes, Jaguar, BMW. And if then we can make a for loop which lets for the car in all cars do something, and then can we, for instance, we can say car is a car, and it can say the name is then car, characters long. And now this for loop will use this variable car and give it different values as specified in this list cars. So for car and cars, we get this variable is changed every time this loop is executed, and it will one by one go through this list. Let's see if this indeed runs. Peugeot is a car, the name is 7 characters long, Renault is a car, 7 characters long, etc. And it runs through the complete list. And another thing that you can do, if you have a for loop and you have a bit of code that's being repeated, of course this bit of code can also contain another for loop inside. And if we then print what the values of those two iterators, as they are called, the variables that run through the iteration as specified by the range function or the list, these running variables, these iterators, then what happens here, I is first set to 0, then this bit of code is executed for I is 0, then it says for j in range 3, so j is set to 0, and it will first numbers that will be printed will be 0, 0. So print also to indicate really the end. And then the next j will be taken, so all values for j will be run inside this for loop, and when it's finished, when it has done 3 values of j, then this for loop is finished, so it will go back to for I and takes the next value for I, and this whole for loop in itself will be repeated 3 times. So in total we should see 9 lines. And indeed, so we see I being 0, j0 to 1, 2, and then I1, 0, 1, 2, etc. Or we could even use this variable, of course, in here, the I, and say, okay, let it run up to I the first time. This, of course, will not give anything, because it runs up to, but not including I. So the first time it's 0, starting at 0, but also ending at 0, means nothing will be done. And then the second time it's 1, and the I is 1, and then j will only get the value 0, as you can see. And then the next time, when I is 2, then j will get the value 0 and 1, the values below 2, as j will always be less than I here. So these are called nested for loops, and if you a typical construct like this is, for instance, a way to run through a complete two-dimensional list, a list of lists. For instance, if we have a list which is defined like this, the first is a list, and the second is also a list, and the other part is also a list. Then we have a list of 3 lists, and each of these lists has 3 elements, and we could use this to print each of the elements of the list. And this is done with square brackets. First take the first list, and then of this list we take j, and then we can print these. And if we want to run all of them at the same, well, let's first run it like this. And we get all the values from left to right, first from per row, basically from this list. You can see this is a two-dimensional list. If I do it like this, Python knows that we're still inside these square brackets, so that this line comes together automatically. We don't even have to add the backslash. And here this two-dimensional list is each of the elements is being printed. If we want to print it in a neater way, we could also specify here that there should be no end. And then only after all the j values have been run, we say print, and then the new line. If we run this, we will see all the numbers being printed after each other. Of course, a space is even better. And then run. We see all the values being printed, and while it stays on the same line. And then after all j's have been run, we will go to the next line. So this is an indication of an illustration of how lists work and how you can use for loops to make a certain part of code repeat a given number of times, which is specified by the number of elements in a list, or the range function with start, stop, step, where stop is not included.